My name is Grace Molino. I'm located at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, the United States. I'm excited to share with you today some work using historical maps to document upland to wetland change. There are a number of resources for historical maps. The types that we commonly use here in the United States are often created by government agencies, such as the United States Coast Guard, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, and the U.S. Geological Survey, or USGS. These maps are typically created for navigational purposes. However, many of these maps go beyond navigable waterways and delineate ecosystems, mark built structures along the coast, such as roads and homes, and may include property lines. They are numerous, as you can see in the image of the United States. Each one of those colored boxes represents a map. And in many areas, such as shown on the image on the right, repeated surveys were conducted, which allows for us to track changes through time before the use of aerial photos became widespread, or to fill in gaps between flights for aerial photos. These maps are all open access and freely available to anyone. And if you're interested, I provided links at the bottom for you to explore those on your own. Now, today I'm specifically going to be talking about using historical maps to focus on upland conversion to wetlands with sea level rise. These ecosystems are separated by an ecotone that we can delineate in aerial imagery, marked here by the yellow dotted line. This usually represents the furthest reach inland of tides. However, as sea level rises, uplands are inundated more frequently. The increase in saturation and salt to the system kills the trees, which you can see here is dead white trees. This allows the marsh to replace what was once a terrestrial ecosystem. This moves the boundary further inland. This process is occurring along the entire Atlantic coast of North America, and in some areas, rapid rates of sea level rise mean that we can actually see the retreat of coastal forests on an annual basis. There has been a lot of work done to track this through time using satellite imagery, but this process has been ongoing since well before we had satellite imagery, which brings us to the use of historical maps. So, as I mentioned, we can use these maps to extend the record well beyond aerial imagery to about the mid-1800s, depending on where you are in the United States. We can also use these maps to quantify historical ecosystem extent and change. So if you look at the T-sheet at the bottom of the screen, those black patches are actually coastal forests that have been delineated, in this case by the US Coast Guard. We can discern patterns of change. So if we look at these maps through time, we can see areas where forests might have disappeared and been replaced by marsh. We can calculate rates of change. We can look at hotspots of change. The maps have also been used to discover historical land management practices that were previously unknown and didn't have any other record other than what was delineated in these maps. And importantly, we can take the findings and use them to inform modern conservation and restoration decisions. So today I'm going to be providing examples on these 3 specific uses that we're going to walk through in more detail. So this first one, using historical maps to quantify historical ecosystem extent and change. For this example, I'm going to be providing figures from Sheeter et al. I have the citation at the bottom of the screen, and the full citation will be on a references slide at the very end of the presentation. So in this study, the authors looked at historical images and historical maps. So in this top panel, we see a NOAA T-sheet from 1853. In the middle box, we see an aerial image from 2013. And so these authors in ArcGIS outlined marsh and upland areas in 1853 and again in 2013 to see where marsh had been lost from erosion at the seaward edge and to see where marsh area had been created through the conversion of uplands to marsh. They then compared these areas of change between the two time steps and created a map, this bottom image, to identify areas of marsh loss and marsh gain. The authors also examined the rate of change of this upland to marsh conversion. So in this process, you use a series of maps in the same location and you georeference them, which means that you find common points in all of the maps, such as the intersection of two roads, so that this way you overlay them exactly on top of each other. And then you delineate that marsh upland boundary in each map, here shown by all of the different pink colored lines. And then once you have these lines delineated, you can calculate the distance between the lines at a certain point and divide that by the number of years between each of those maps. And that's how you get your annual rate of change, in this case in meters per year. The authors pulled this all together by looking at migration rate on that upland boundary edge, and then the erosion rate at the seaward marsh edge, as well as quantifying the net change in area. So looking at the comparison between upland loss and creation of marsh and marsh loss into water. And interestingly found that creation of marsh versus marsh loss actually balanced itself out in this particular study area. Now, there are some important limitations to the use of historical maps for this kind of study. The most important being that there is a lack of coverage in this particular area, and this does exist well beyond just the Chesapeake Bay where this was studied. But you can see in this figure from the paper the coverage of all the maps used in the study in the dark gray boxes. So this was about a fourth of the study area. Another limitation is the time steps available for calculating the rate of change. So that is totally reliant on how many repeat surveys were recorded in that area. In some places that could be 2 maps, and other places that could be 5 maps, which does change how you compare between sites. There also are issues with map quality. So in some of these areas, where there's a lack of coverage, it could be that there were maps there, but they were of such poor quality that you couldn't distinguish between uplands and marsh within that map, and so they were unusable for this study. But overall, a really neat application of the historical maps. All right, the second use we're going to go over today is the use of historical maps for the discovery of historical land management practices. So this image is the same image from the title slide of the presentation, and I want you to focus on that really interesting shape on the right side of the photo. So it's shaped kind of like a pentagon of all these straight edges, which if you work in wetlands is pretty unusual to see. Wetlands are usually, pretty patchy and look more like the left side of the image. And so these were features that we started to notice by looking at aerial imagery. And so this is a study that I was involved with, kind of in its later stages. And after looking through aerial imagery for other projects, I started to see more and more places where there are these really unusual shaped features in the marshes. And so we went out into the field and examined them there. And there were these pretty distinct features. In this case, you can see 2 students, one standing on top of this feature and the other next to it. There's a really substantial difference in elevation there. So then we went further digging back into some historical maps. And in this case, you can see there actually is a feature delineated in this map. And so what we came to learn was that these are levees. These are small earthen features that were dug into the landscape by private landowners in order to reduce the inundation of uplands by tides. And so when we discovered these in these maps and then kind of zoomed out a bit, we realized that these were extremely extensive throughout the coastal landscape that we were working in. But there is very little research that we could find on them. And so this prompted a study kind of diving through all of these historical records and combining it with fieldwork to understand a bit more about these features. So one of the things we did was use the historical records to identify where these features were, and then delineate them in ArcGIS. And so that image on the right has all of the levees that we were able to identify, traced out in orange. And so in this study, we were able to quantify this widespread historic barrier to upland conversion to marsh that still exists in the landscape today. And we're also able to reconstruct the age of these features, as many of them were put in over a century ago, long before the current landowners came to own the property, and did that through a really neat combination of T-sheets, topographic maps, and aerial imagery. Now, this type of study also has some limitations. So we see here on this panel of images, so this is how we reconstructed the age of one of these features. Again, the T-sheets intermixed with aerial imagery, USGS topobathies, and that feature exists in all of these images. However, that is not always the case. So this is another USGS topobathy that was produced in between those two middle panels, that image and the other topobathy. And in this case, there's no levee identified in that image. So for whatever reason, these features were not captured. And so this inconsistency in records limited the age restraints that we could put on these features. It also limited the extent of the study because they only had so many maps which identified the levees, and that was rather limited. But still, overall, we're able to use it to produce one of the first quantifications of these levee features within the coastal landscape. The third study that I want to talk about today is using these historic maps to inform modern conservation and restoration decisions. So in this case, this study showed that historical land use influences what happens to upland when it experiences sea level rise. Now this one we shipped a little bit further north into the Delaware Bay using some New Jersey state resources, again along the Atlantic coast of the United States. In this case, the authors of the study were interested in understanding how land reclamation practices in the 1800s influenced upland conversion to marsh today. So when we talk about reclaimed land, this is areas of marshlands that were diked and drained for agricultural purposes. And so in this panel here to the left, they have delineated in this historic map from 1888 all the areas of the marshland that were reclaimed. And so the authors of this study then paired that with a historic aerial image and a modern aerial image. And they took that delineation of the impoundment from the historical map and they carried that through these time steps. And they looked at how the land within the impoundment changed through time. And if it went back to marsh, if it converted to open water, and then they compared that to natural undisturbed marshes within this same system. And so this study used these maps to quantify the acreage of previously impounded marsh. They found that the historical impoundments were actually the largest contributor to marsh loss to sea level rise in the study area. And the marshes that reformed or survived these impoundments were incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. This was in part due to an elevation deficit and different species compared to natural marshes. And these vulnerable surviving marshes required different restoration practices. And so just as an example that they went through in this study, and so we see, at the bottom here, this area of light green, that's an impoundment within the marsh. You can see the difference in elevation, so it is much, much lower than the surrounding marsh. And that's because it's been cut off from tidal axis, which brings in sediments. And so it has subsided since that impoundment was formed. Now this impoundment breached during a hurricane and completely flooded. And in years after, no marsh reformed. It was just too deep of an elevation to have vegetation survive. And so this is a type of area where you can't simply breach an impoundment in order to restore those areas and allow for marsh migration. Instead, it requires bringing in sediment, digging tidal channels. A lot more effort has to go into restoring these areas so that you don't just get open. This study occurred over a massive spatial scale, so over 36,000 hectares. But because of the amount of detail that goes into this type of work, it's really difficult to expand this beyond, say, a single coastline of a state or to the entire Atlantic coast. There also was uncertainty in some of the maps. You can see in the figure all the purple areas or places where they couldn't determine the impoundment status of that marsh based on the historical maps and images. And so, just to wrap this all up, historical maps are an underutilized resource in coastal research. They can be used to quantify previous ecosystem extent and changes due to both natural and anthropogenic forcings. These historic maps may hold the only record of past land management practices in some regions. And understanding previous ecosystem prevalence and human impacts can be used to improve the success of modern restoration efforts. If you have any specific questions on any of these studies or methods, I provided the references to each here and would be more than happy to chat during the breakout sessions. I've also included references to a few other studies which use historical maps. I focused today mostly on the Atlantic coast, but these maps have been used on all coasts in the United States as well as beyond the United States. Just want to give a final thank you to the IGCP 725 organizers for hosting this great virtual workshop, and I hope to see some of you during the breakout sessions.